If you spent your entire life seeking revenge, but discovered that the only path to truth required destroying the person you had grown to love, what would you choose? Justice or forgiveness? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? The thick smoke burned her lungs, the intense heat ripped through her skin, and all Kate Larson could hear was the desperate echo of her own breathing. The ground shook beneath his feet, wood collapsed around him, and his mother's scream disappeared amid the roar of the flames. She tried to run, tried to hold on to that hand that was moving further and further away, but the fire consumed everything and the darkness swallowed her before she could scream. The sound of a brutal alarm clock interrupted the memory, pulling Kate out of a nightmare that had insisted on haunting her for years. His eyes shot open, his heart hammering against his chest. The small apartment was in the pre-dawn gloom, and cold sweat was running down the back of his neck. She ran her hand over her left shoulder, feeling through the fabric the hidden scar, the only physical reminder of the night that destroyed her childhood. He took a deep breath. This was no time to get lost in the past. 20 minutes later, Kate was already crossing the busy streets of Seoul, her hair tied up and a folder of documents firmly held between her arms. The day had barely started and she was already late for the most important hearing of her career. The case against SG Group, one of Korea's largest developers, could define her future as a lawyer. But, more than that, it could prevent dozens of families from losing their homes. She hurried into the courtroom, adjusting the collar of her blazer as she took a deep breath. The room was packed, journalists and lawyers exchanged whispers, and in the center of the room, sitting with irritating calm, was William Carter, the CEO of SG Group. The man Kate hated without ever meeting in person. He looked up the moment she entered, as if he had already expected her presence. Kate felt a shiver run down her spine, but she didn't look away. William was exactly as the newspapers described: impeccable, cold, dangerous. He wore a tailored suit, exuding a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and held a wristwatch between his fingers as if he didn't even need to pay attention to the trial. Kate walked to her position and prepared herself. The judge began the session, and as soon as she opened her mouth to present her arguments, William smiled. Not a friendly smile, but one that carried a challenge. As if saying, "Go ahead, try to beat me." Anger boiled inside her. Kate didn't know exactly why, but that man awakened something visceral in her. Maybe it was the carefree way he treated the fate of so many people, maybe it was the way he didn't even seem to consider the possibility of losing. But losing was not an option for her. When he began to speak, his voice echoed steadily throughout the room. She detailed the abuses committed by SG Group, the way the company manipulated contracts to expel residents without just cause. His speech was sharp, each word meticulously chosen. But instead of showing any sign of concern, William just tilted his head slightly, observing her as if he was analyzing every detail of her. Then, when she finished, he finally spoke. His voice was low, calm, but carried a weight that made the entire room hold its breath. He said that, unfortunately, SG Group only operated within the law. That feelings should not override facts. That she was wasting time. Kate felt her blood boil. Was he really that cold? So indifferent to other people's suffering? The hearing continued, but for Kate, that clash was far from over. When the session adjourned for a recess, she strode out of the courtroom, only to find William waiting for her at the exit. He said he expected a little more challenge. Who, from what he heard about her, thought she would be a more interesting opponent. Kate clenched her jaw. She said he should prepare himself because he hadn't seen anything yet. William smiled again. A dangerous smile. And in that moment, Kate knew that this man wasn't just her enemy in court. He was someone who could turn your life upside down. She just didn't know yet whether it was destructive or inevitable. Kate felt her footsteps echo heavily against the cold marble of the courtroom as she walked down the long, silent hallway. The smell of reheated coffee mixed with the woody perfume of the judges and lawyers who were rushing around, but none of that could dispel the anger that was boiling under his skin. William Carter's every word still resonated in her mind, as if his deep voice had permeated her thoughts. He expected more from her. As if all the effort, all the dedication he put into that case was nothing more than a mediocre show for his entertainment. Kate clenched her fists as she remembered the way he looked at her, as if she were just another piece in a game he already knew he would win. William remained standing at the exit of the courtroom, his hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored suit, the relaxed posture of someone who didn't have a single trace of concern on his face. The dark strands of her hair were perfectly aligned, without a single one out of place, and his gaze studied her with a mix of interest and superiority. He said he found it curious how much she seemed carried away by emotion. Passion might be an admirable quality, but in court, it was just a symptom of defeat. Kate kept her expression impassive, but felt her chest tighten. He wasn't just belittling your work, he was mocking your conviction, the reason you chose to fight. She took a deep breath and walked past him without responding, ignoring the subtle smile that formed on his lips, as if he had already anticipated that reaction. But just as she reached the courtroom door and felt the cold morning air hit her face, she heard William call out to her again. He asked her if she really believed she could beat him. Kate stopped, feeling the wind ruffle the loose strands of her hair, and turned just enough to face him. She said she didn't care what he thought. The only thing that mattered was that he prepare himself, because she wouldn't stop until she saw that process bring him down. William tilted his head, assessing her for a brief moment, before letting out an almost imperceptible laugh. He said he admired her confidence, but in the end, everyone learns that the world is not driven by justice, but by power. And whoever has power defines what is fair. Kate felt the blood pound in her temples. That conversation was useless. No matter how much he tried to destabilize her, she wouldn't back down. Before he could turn away for good, his phone vibrated in his blazer pocket. She answered immediately, recognizing her boss's number, her voice filled with impatience demanding her immediate presence in the office. Kate mumbled a quick reply and hung up, hurrying toward the taxi rank. Behind her, William stood still, watching her leave with an unreadable gaze. The ride to the office was a blur of buildings and bright signs passing by the taxi window, but Kate barely noticed them. Her mind was caught up in the audience, in the arguments she could have reinforced, in William's cold expressions that seemed to challenge her at every turn. When he finally reached the law building, he felt the muscles in his shoulder tense. The office where she worked was renowned, but for her, it always seemed like an arena where she needed to prove her worth at every moment. As soon as she entered the boss's room, the heavy atmosphere enveloped her like a blow. The middle-aged man, with an eternally dissatisfied expression, barely waited for her to sit down before launching his first criticism. He said his presentation in court was strong, but still not strong enough. SG Group was a powerful adversary, and if Kate really wanted to win this case, she needed to go further. He needed to find a flaw, something that could destabilize William before he effortlessly crushed them. Kate listened in silence, keeping her expression steady as she felt the weight of responsibility intensify. She knew this case was big, but the way her boss spoke made it clear that it wasn't just about justice. It was about winning, no matter what. When he left the room, he felt the pressure increase even more. There was a lot at stake. It couldn't fail. The day passed amid an avalanche of documents, meetings, and exhaustive research. Kate barely had time to eat lunch, barely noticed the passing of the hours until she realized that the sky outside was already dark. The city glowed with vibrant lights, the endless stream of cars and pedestrians creating a chaotic scene that matched the turmoil in his mind. She closed the last file tightly, leaning back in her chair as she massaged her temples. He needed a break, a moment to reorganize his thoughts. She decided to go out for a coffee. The cold night air enveloped her as soon as she walked through the building's doors. But what she didn't expect was to find William there, casually leaning against a luxurious black car, as if he was waiting for her. He looked at her unhurriedly, his dark eyes shining in the soft streetlights. He said he didn't like wasting time, so he would get straight to the point. He wanted to know what exactly Kate thought she would get out of this case. Did you really believe you could defeat him, or were you just clinging to an illusion? Kate felt the anger return, but she refused to show it. She replied that she didn't care what he thought. If he was so confident he would win, then why did he seem so interested in her? William smirked, as if he appreciated the provocation. He said he found the way she fought interesting, as if she were carrying something bigger than just a lawsuit. As if, for her, this was personal. Kate felt a shiver run down her spine. He was too perceptive. Too dangerous. I needed to keep my distance. She said William could think whatever he wanted, but she wouldn't back down. He laughed softly and took a step forward, the proximity making Kate notice, for the first time, the sophisticated perfume he wore, a subtle blend of wood and spice, as intense as himself. Then, he said he was eager to see how far she would go to try to take him down. Kate didn't respond. She just kept her gaze fixed on his for a few seconds before turning and walking away. But even after pulling away, she could feel his presence burning in her thoughts, like a shadow that refused to disappear. The rain started suddenly, thick and merciless, turning the streets of Seoul into a distorted reflection of lights and silhouettes beneath the sodden asphalt. Kate pulled her coat against her body, feeling the cold wind pass through the thin fabric of her blouse. She should have checked the weather forecast before leaving the office, but her mind was so immersed in the case that she didn't even notice the change in the weather. Now, alone in the middle of a busy sidewalk, surrounded by strangers running with umbrellas, she felt trapped in a storm that seemed to extend beyond the sky. She hurriedly walked to the edge of the street, raising her hand to hail a taxi, but every vehicle that passed by was already occupied. He cursed under his breath, feeling the frustration build up along with the exhaustion of the day. The court, William's calculating gaze, his boss's sharp words, everything swirled in his head like a private storm that refused to let up. That's when, on the other side of the street, she saw the figure she least wanted to meet that night. William Carter stood under the awning of an office building, his impeccable dark suit contrasting with the wet city around him. He held a closed umbrella in his hand, his eyes roaming the street as if observing a trivial scene. But then, as if he already knew he was being watched, he slowly turned his head and found her in the crowd. Kate felt an immediate chill, not from fear, but from something she couldn't name. William didn't look away. Instead, he began walking toward her with an unnerving calm, as if the rain was in no hurry to catch up with him. Kate forced herself to look away. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of thinking his presence bothered her. But before he could think of a way to completely ignore it, a thunderous sound ripped through the air. Tires squealed on the wet asphalt, a scream echoed through the rain, and in the blink of an eye, everything went into slow motion. A runaway motorcycle suddenly came around the bend, skidding at high speed towards the sidewalk where Kate was standing. The reflex was instantaneous. She tried to step back, but before she could move, she felt a sudden impact pulling at her arm. The world spun in a blur of rain, lights, and unexpected heat against his skin. When she blinked, panting, she realized she was wrapped in a firm hug, the sound of the motorcycle hitting a sign echoing behind her. Her heart was beating so hard that Kate needed a few seconds to understand what had happened. The heat against her body wasn't hers. The woody and subtly spicy smell invaded your senses, and the breath next to your ear was not yours. William was holding her. She felt the muscles in her arm tense before she pushed him away, confusion and adrenaline mixing in a whirlwind inside her. Asked why the hell he touched her. William, still standing in the rain, just raised an eyebrow and said he would rather not see his opponent get run over so soon. The tone was casual, but something in his eyes indicated there was more than sarcasm in his response. Kate felt her face heat up, but not because of the cold or embarrassment. It was irritation. He always seemed in control, always looked at her as if he knew something she didn't. Before he could respond, the murmur of the surrounding crowd grew. Some people approached to see if she was okay, while a man, probably the person delivering the accident, tried to recover himself a few meters away. The scene was becoming a public spectacle, and Kate didn't want to give anyone the chance to speculate about what had just happened. She turned on her heel, intending to leave without another word, but William grabbed her wrist before she could walk away. The touch was firm but restrained, and Kate felt every nerve in her body react instantly. He said the rain was getting worse and she wouldn't be able to get a taxi anytime soon. If he wanted, he would take her home. Kate let out a disbelieving laugh, snatching her hand out of his grasp. He said he would rather face a hurricane than accept a ride from someone like him. William smirked, as if he had already expected that answer, and said that she could pretend as much as she wanted, but deep down, she knew that he wasn't so easy to avoid. Anger flashed in Kate's eyes, but before she could retort, a black car stopped near the sidewalk, and William, without another word, got into the vehicle. The dark glass slowly rose, but before it disappeared completely, she could still see his gaze passing through her as if marking his presence within her. Kate stood there, standing in the rain, feeling her heart still racing from the shock and from something she couldn't explain. That night, as he tried to sleep, his mind replayed the same scene countless times. The sound of the bike, the sudden pull, the heat of his body against hers, the way he held her without hesitation. And for the first time, an uncomfortable thought crept into his mind like a silent curse: William Carter was not just his enemy. He was a problem she still didn't know how to solve. In the days that followed, Kate realized that William Carter was like a persistent shadow, lingering in the corners of her mind even as she tried to push him away. It wasn't just because of the clash in court or the inexplicable tension that hovered between them. It was the way he challenged her without even needing to raise his voice, as if every word he said carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. And maybe that was exactly what made her angrier, the fact that he didn't need to try to provoke her. He just existed that way. But Kate wasn't the type to back down from battle. If William thought he could manipulate her, play with her conviction as if she were a naive child, then he was about to discover that she was not someone easy to bend. And it was with this determination that he began to devour every document, every contract, and every clause of SG Group, hoping to find something that could bring him down. The hours dragged by between stacks of papers and bright computer screens, eyes burning from reading financial reports and internal company records. Kate was sure there was something there, something hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy carefully stacked to confuse any inattentive eye. So when he finally found a discrepancy in one of the land acquisitions, he felt a shiver of excitement run down his spine. The numbers didn't add up. SG Group had purchased properties for much less than officially declared value, masking transactions that, on the surface, appeared legal but could indicate bribery or price manipulation. The next morning, armed with this discovery, Kate walked through the court doors earlier than usual, determined to use this information to pressure William. But to her frustration, he didn't show up. Instead, one of SG Group's lawyers appeared in his place, delivering a formal request for a postponement. Kate felt her fingers tighten around the folder. Was he running away? Or worse, did he already know she would find something? Her irritation only increased when, upon leaving the courtroom, she found William casually leaning against her car, as if he had been waiting for her. The dark jacket contrasted with the soft glow of the morning, and the serene expression on his face made your blood boil. He asked if she was disappointed that he didn't attend the hearing. Kate crossed her arms, keeping her chin up, and said that disappointed wasn't the right word. He just found it curious how a man so confident of his victory seemed to be avoiding a direct confrontation. William laughed softly, a sound that made his skin crawl with anger. He said she was too impatient. Some battles needed to be fought at the right time. Kate clenched her jaw, refusing to fall for his taunt. I said maybe he was right. Some battles needed to be fought at the right time, and perhaps it was best that he took advantage of this time to review his company's financial records, because he had found something that could change the entire course of this process. William narrowed his eyes slightly, the first genuine reaction she managed to get from him, but the smile soon returned, slow and calculated. He said he admired her determination but hoped she knew what she was getting into. Companies like SG Group were not brought down by enthusiasm. Kate stepped forward, feeling the tension thick in the air between them, and said he underestimated what the truth could do. William watched her for a moment before slightly tilting his head, as if he was considering something. Then, with the same irritating calmness, he opened the car door and said he would see how far she could get. Kate stood there, watching the car disappear through the traffic, feeling the adrenaline pumping through her veins. It wasn't just a court case. It wasn't just a corporate dispute. This was turning into a game of resistance, and neither of them seemed willing to give in first. Night fell over Seoul in a blanket of diffused lights and treacherous shadows, reflected in the windows of tall buildings that seemed to silently peer into the secrets hidden beneath the city. Kate sat in the small apartment she called home, papers spread across the table as the cool light from the lamp illuminated her notes. The silence of the environment contrasted with the chaos in his mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that extended beyond SG Group's suspicious dealings. It was as if he had touched the end of an invisible thread, and pulling it would bring to light something much greater than he expected. She ran her fingers over the scar on her shoulder, an unconscious habit whenever she felt restless. The fire that destroyed her childhood, the confused memories of that night, the screams that echoed in the corners of her mind at the most unexpected moments. All of this was part of her, a mark that would never disappear. But why, suddenly, did William Carter's presence seem to stir up something so deeply buried? He decided he needed more answers. His instinct told him this case was more than just a legal dispute. Something about that company carried a familiar smell of destruction, and she needed to find out what it was. He called one of his sources, an investigative journalist who had helped on previous cases. He said he needed any information about SG Group, especially its previous years. The man hesitated for a moment before asking if she knew what she was asking. Companies like that didn't leave easy trails to follow, and messing with these types of people could have consequences. Kate closed her eyes for a moment before replying that she didn't mind. If there was something there, she needed to know. The next day, the courtroom was more charged than usual, an invisible tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Kate arrived early, her footsteps echoing across the cold marble, the briefcase with her new discoveries clutched in her arms. But before he could focus on what he needed to present that day, he saw William in the hallway, talking to a man who made his stomach instantly turn. The president of SG Group. Charles Carter. William's father. She stopped midway, feeling the air become heavier around her. The man exuded a quiet power, the rigid stance of someone who carried the fate of countless lives without ever questioning the consequences of his decisions. His eyes, however, were what bothered her the most. They were cold. Empty. Different from William's, which always carried a calculated brilliance, a silent provocation. Charles Carter's eyes were those of someone who had seen the world burn and was unfazed by it. William noticed her presence before she could decide whether to move away. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Kate felt something she couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't a challenge. It was a silent recognition. As if, for some reason she didn't yet understand, he knew that moment would change everything. The hearing was more intense than usual, Kate's arguments sharp as razors, cutting through every justification presented by SG Group's defense. But William didn't back down. He remained impassive, responding to her every advance with the calmness of someone who had already anticipated each movement. It was a suffocating struggle, and when the session finally ended, Kate felt as if she had been through a storm. She was putting away her papers when she heard his voice next to her. William said she was digging too deep. Kate didn't even need to look to know he was serious, without the teasing tone he usually used whenever he spoke to her. He replied that he should be worried then. Because if there was something to be discovered, she wouldn't stop until she found it. He sighed lightly, and when he spoke again, his tone no longer carried irony, only a restrained heaviness. He asked her if she really thought she was prepared for any answer she might encounter. Kate frowned, feeling a twinge of discomfort creep under her skin. William never spoke like that. He always played, always tested her limits. But right there, in that moment, he seemed to be giving her a real warning. She didn't respond. You just picked up your things and left the courtroom, trying to ignore the weight of his gaze on your back. That night, when he finally received the journalist's report, his fingers trembled slightly as he opened the file. His heart raced as the documents revealed details of SG Group's expansion over the years, land acquisitions in vulnerable areas, contracts signed by shell companies, money that disappeared and reappeared under different names. And then, in the middle of the pages, he found something that made his blood run cold. One of SG Group's first major projects involved the expropriation of a village on the outskirts of Seoul. The land was purchased for a paltry sum after a fire ravaged the area, rendering the property unusable for its former residents. Kate felt her vision blur for a moment. A fire. The year was exactly the same as the tragedy that destroyed his family. Her hands fisted around the paper, her heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to rip out of her chest. Did William know this? Did he know that his family name was involved in the greatest tragedy of his life? A million questions flooded his mind, but one stood out above them all. If Charles Carter was behind that fire, then what did it mean for William? Was he just a cog in his father's empire, or was he an accomplice in something much bigger? Kate felt anger rising to the surface, an explosive mix of pain, confusion, and a fear she refused to admit. She had sworn that she would take down the SG Group. But now, the war he was waging with William was no longer just about a court case. It was about the past that haunted her all her life. And in the midst of this war, the only thing he still didn't know was whether William was his most dangerous enemy or the key to discovering the truth. The night air was heavy, thick with moisture from recent rains, and the distant sound of cars sliding across wet asphalt seemed distant to Kate as she sat in front of the documents spread out on her desk. The yellow light from the lamp flickered faintly, casting shadows over the words that now weighed more heavily than any lawsuit he had ever faced. The fire. SG Group's name is linked to the tragedy that shaped it. The presence of Charles Carter hovering over everything like an invisible ghost that has somehow always been there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Kate's stomach turned as she read and reread the reports, trying to find some loophole, something that could turn that suspicion into an indisputable truth. But each line he analyzed only tightened the knot inside him even more. SG Group directly benefited from the destruction of its former home. People like your father and mother were not just victims of an accident. They were sacrificed pieces on a board she was barely beginning to understand. And then, there was William. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to ignore the image of him invading her thoughts. Did he know? Was he part of it? Or was he just another son carrying the weight of his father's decisions? It didn't matter. It couldn't matter. Kate grabbed the documents and stuffed them into the leather briefcase before her mind could continue spinning in circles. He got up, grabbing his coat and leaving the apartment with quick steps. I needed to confront him. He needed to see his reaction with his own eyes. The night was cold when she arrived at the imposing SG Group building, the mirrored windows reflecting the city lights like a sleeping monster that watched everything from above. She knew she couldn't just walk in, but she didn't have to. Fate, once again, seemed to have its own way of bringing them together. When Kate turned the corner, her footsteps stopped when she saw him there. William was standing next to his black car, his posture rigid, his shoulders tense as if carrying an invisible weight. He held the phone to his ear, but his expression was not that of a man having a business conversation. It was a closed expression, filled with something she couldn't completely decipher. Then, as if he had sensed her presence before he even saw her, he slowly turned his head, and their eyes met in the darkness. For a moment, Kate felt the world around her disappear. William's eyes held hers for too long, and Kate realized, with an involuntary shiver, that he looked different. The man who always had a calculated smile and a sharp look in his eyes was now serious, as if he was dealing with something that was eating him up inside. But before she could say anything, he hung up the phone and walked towards her with controlled steps, his expression closing in like a wall. He asked why she was there. Kate narrowed her eyes, her chest still rising and falling with her rapid breathing from the run there. I said I needed to talk to him. That there was something he should see. William took a deep breath, running a hand over his face before replying that no matter what it was, he wasn't interested. Then he took a step back, as if he were about to get into the car and end the conversation there. But Kate rushed forward before he could move away. He said he didn't believe him. Something was wrong, and he knew it. William stopped, his fingers still on the car door, but he didn't open it. He stood still for a moment, as if debating whether he should just ignore her or if there was something in him that still couldn't let her go. Kate pulled the papers out of her bag and held them in front of him. He said those documents proved that SG Group directly benefited from the fire that destroyed his family. That company not only bought land, but profited from the tragedy of innocent people. William's expression didn't change immediately. Her eyes slid to the papers for a brief moment, and Kate saw the almost imperceptible spark of something ignite within them. But then, he laughed. A short, humorless laugh, a laugh that made Kate feel a different shiver run across her skin. He said she really thought she was revealing something he didn't know. Confusion crashed against Kate like a wave. For a moment, she just stood there, her heart thundering against her ribs, until she finally told him he was lying. If he knew, he wouldn't be so calm. William took a step forward, and now they were close enough that she could see the details of his face under the soft street lights. The tension in his jaw, the way his dark eyes carried a silent storm. He said he always knew his father's empire was built on ruins. I just didn't know that one of those ruins was her story. Kate felt her lungs constrict. He knew. Not exactly about his family, but he knew that SG Group was not a clean company. And yet he remained there, being part of it, carrying that surname, using the money built on other people's suffering. Anger rose before she could stop it. He asked how he could live with that. How could he look in the mirror knowing his life was financed by tragedies? William didn't look away. He replied that she wouldn't understand. Kate laughed, a bitter laugh, her chest feeling tight with frustration. I said he was right. She would never understand how someone could choose to close their eyes to their own past, to their own wounds. That if he really believed he could continue living like this, then he was more of a coward than she imagined. Silence fell between them like a blow. William didn't respond immediately. He just looked away for a moment, as if there was something in him that was slowly breaking. But then, he took a deep breath and looked at her again. He said that if she wanted to fight this war, then she should do it alone. He didn't want to be part of it anymore. Kate felt a chill run down her spine when she heard that. It wasn't just a rejection of the process. He was trying to cut her out of his life. And for the first time, that idea seemed to hurt in a way she hadn't expected. She watched him get into the car and disappear into traffic, the red taillights blinking like a silent goodbye. He stood there, in the middle of the empty sidewalk, feeling the rain start to fall again. But something inside her said that it wouldn't end there. William Carter could try to escape, but fate seemed to have other plans for them. The night seemed endless. Kate felt every beat of her heart resound like a muffled drum in her ears, the weight of the documents in her hands becoming unbearable. The computer screen still glowed before her, the open files displaying the truth she had never imagined needing to face. William's name was there. Not directly, not as an obvious culprit, but buried among records, transactions and contracts that linked his past to hers in such a cruel way that the air seemed to run out of him. SG Group had not only profited from the fire that destroyed his family. Charles Carter's name was directly linked to the expropriations that took place after the tragedy, the negotiations made with public bodies, the silent promises of reconstruction that were never fulfilled. And among the papers, there was something even worse. An old document, signed by a then-young William Carter, authorizing the transfer of funds for a project linked to that same land. Kate felt her vision blur for a moment, her stomach tightening as if she had been physically hit. His chest rose and fell unevenly, while his mind desperately tried to process the implication of that role. William knew. Maybe not from everything, maybe not from the fire itself, but he had signed a document that helped seal the fate of that place. That piece of paper, which now trembled between her fingers, was proof that he had always been linked to the worst moment of her life, in a way that she could never forgive. He stood up so quickly that the chair scraped loudly against the floor, a sharp sound that echoed through the silent apartment. Adrenaline coursed through her body like liquid fire, a mix of anger, shock, and pain she didn't know she could feel. I needed to see him. I needed to face him and hear from him what it all meant. He crossed the streets of Seoul like a figure, his hurried steps ignoring the sharp early morning wind. The building where William lived stood like a fortress before her, the lights still on indicating that he was there. The security guard hesitated when he saw her, but Kate didn't even give him time to react. His voice was firm, filled with controlled desperation, saying that if he didn't let her pass, she would find another way in. The man, perhaps recognizing something in her eyes that made him think twice, just stepped back, allowing her entry. He climbed the floors in the elevator without noticing the tense reflection in the mirror in front of him. When the doors opened, she moved before she could hesitate. He rang the doorbell once, then again, until the door finally opened. William was there, without his usual impeccable suit, wearing only a white shirt with the first buttons loose, his initially surprised expression closing when he saw her expression. He asked what he was doing there at that hour, but Kate ignored the question, pushing the documents against his chest. He said he wanted answers. He said he wanted to know how long he was part of it. William hesitantly took the papers, his eyes sliding across the pages, and the moment he realized what she had discovered, his expression changed. The shock, the tension, the silent guilt, it was all there, painted in his dark eyes in a way that made her throat tighten. But what really destroyed her was his silence. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to defend himself. She felt the anger rise like a violent tide, her eyes burning as she asked why he never told her anything. How could he have signed this? How could you have been part of something that destroyed your life? William finally took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment before saying he didn't know. That, at the time, he just signed what his father told him to do. That he had no idea what that land meant. Kate laughed, a bitter, sharp laugh, saying it didn't change anything. That, consciously or not, he was part of it all. William ran a hand over his face, his shoulders rigid, as if he knew there were no words that could fix this. He said he didn't want her to find out like that. His words cut deeper than she imagined. Didn't you want her to find out like this? That meant he knew. That at some point, he realized that there was something between them that wasn't just a clash in court, that something much deeper connected them. And yet, he hid it. The pain became unbearable. She took a step back, her voice shaky as she asked if he really thought he could keep this buried. If he really thought that one day all this wouldn't come back to haunt them. William stared at her, and for the first time, his expression wasn't cold, wasn't calculated. It was the expression of a man who knew he was about to lose something he didn't want to lose. He said he didn't know what to do. Kate felt tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tremor in her voice as she said that it didn't matter now. He might not know what to do, but she did. He said he would go all the way, that he would expose everything, that he would ensure that SG Group paid for what they did. William didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, standing in the doorway, watching her as if he already knew there was nothing more that could be said. Kate left the apartment without looking back, but with every step she took, she felt like she was leaving something behind that she should never have found. The world broke beneath his feet that night. And in the midst of the pieces, she knew she would never look at William Carter the same way again. The rain lashed Seoul like an angry wail from the heavens, thick drops exploding against the glass windows as Kate crossed the city, seeing nothing but the anger that pulsed in her chest. The cold water soaked through his coat, clung to the loose strands of his hair, but none of that mattered. The only thing she could feel was the pain vibrating through every fiber of her body, a pain so overwhelming it made her want to scream until there was nothing left inside her. William had destroyed everything. He was the man she hated. The man who represented everything she spent her entire life fighting against. And at the same time, he was the one who challenged her, the one who made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with anger or revenge. But now, it all seemed like a cruel illusion. Every look they exchanged, every provocation, every moment when the air between them became too heavy, everything fell apart in the split second in which Kate saw her name linked to the greatest tragedy of her life. She arrived at the office drenched, her footsteps echoing cold against the marble as she walked through the halls with sharp determination. Her colleagues glanced at her, some surprised by her appearance, but no one dared to say anything. It didn't matter. Nothing else mattered other than what she was about to do. The door to his boss's office opened abruptly, and he looked up, surprised by his presence. He asked if she had found anything new. Kate threw the documents on the table, the papers still damp from the rain, but every word written there burned like fire. He said he wanted to pursue the complaint. He said he wanted to take this to the end, expose SG Group, unmask every dirty piece of that rotten empire. His boss took the papers, analyzing them silently, before letting out a heavy sigh. Said she knew what she was getting into. He said that if they did that, William and his father would fight back with all their might. Kate felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the table. He said he didn't care. But it was a lie. Because in the midst of that storm of hatred and revenge, there was something inside her that hesitated. Something that irritated her, that infuriated her, that made her stomach turn. Because as much as she wanted to destroy William, she also wanted to understand. She wanted to know if he had felt guilty, if at some point, before she found out, he had intended to tell her the truth. But that didn't matter. It couldn't matter. She left the room before any doubts could gnaw at her any further, and spent the rest of the day immersed in work, trying to get lost in reports, contracts, and strategic planning for the case. But his body was restless, his mind on fire. So when her phone rang and William's name appeared on the screen, her heart froze. She stared at the display for long seconds, her breath caught in her throat, her hands suddenly cold. Every cell in your body screamed to ignore. To erase him from your life as he deserved. But he answered. His voice came low, almost hesitant, something rare in someone like William. He asked where she was. Kate laughed, but there was no humor in her tone. He said it didn't matter, because there was nothing else they needed to talk about. He was silent for a moment, and then said he was waiting for her. She should have hung up. Should have ignored it. But somehow, his feet moved on their own, and the next thing he knew, he was in front of the luxurious hotel where he used to stay when he wanted to escape the watchful eyes of SG Group. He was at the bar, sitting alone, a glass of whiskey in his hands and his gaze lost in the view of the illuminated city. When he saw her, he straightened his posture, but didn't smile. Kate walked up to him without hesitation, sitting across from him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the tension between them was thick, suffocating, charged with all the unspoken words that seemed to hang in the air like electricity before a storm. William was the first to speak. He said he knew she wanted to destroy him. Who knew that, after what she discovered, there was no going back? Kate kept her expression firm, her eyes cold as she replied that he was right. That she was going to take down SG Group, and that she didn't care if he went along in the process. William let out a short sigh, a bitter laugh slipping past his lips. He said she was always relentless. Kate leaned forward slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, and asked if he really didn't mind. If he would really accept being destroyed without a fight. William looked at her, and for a second, what he saw in her eyes made her catch her breath. There was something there. Something he has never demonstrated before. He said the truth was he didn't know what to believe anymore. Confusion lit inside her like a match struck in the dark. For the first time, William Carter seemed lost. As if he was on the edge of something that even he couldn't name. And Kate hated the fact that, even in that moment, even after everything, she still wanted to understand what was going on inside him. But he couldn't. She got up, grabbing her bag, saying that the next time they saw each other, it would be in court. William didn't try to stop her. He just watched her walk away, his gaze burning into her back as if he was recording that moment in his memory. Kate left the hotel feeling like she had left something behind, something she could never get back. But it didn't matter. The path to his revenge was set. The darkness inside William Carter has never seemed so thick. The glare of Soul's lights reflected against the glass of his office, casting angular shadows on the table covered in contracts, reports and decisions that could define his future. The silence was absolute, except for the low sound of ice melting inside the glass of whiskey forgotten next to his hand. The truth hung over him like an unbearable weight, and for the first time in years, he didn't know which way to go. Kate would destroy him. He knew that. She was fire and steel, a storm that would not recede, and now that she discovered the truth about her past, there was no more room for hesitation. But what she didn't know was that he himself had been at war with SG Group for much longer than he let on. William picked up one of the contracts on the table, his eyes scanning the words he had already read hundreds of times. It was an internal deal, one of many that propped up his father's empire with a web of murky transactions, embezzlements and negotiations that benefited only those already at the top. For years he turned a blind eye, signed papers without question, kept to the line that Charles Carter had drawn for him. But that didn't make him innocent. The image of Kate haunted him. Her look, full of hurt and anger, the heavy silence between them before she left the hotel. For the first time, he wondered if he had already completely missed the chance to repair what was broken. But the scariest question wasn't that. It was if he really wanted her to give up on destroying him. His phone screen lit up, showing an unknown number. He answered without thinking, the voice of the private investigator he had hired filling the silence. The man said he had gained access to old documents, something William might want to see. There were records that indicated that the burning of the village where Kate grew up was not an accident, as SG Group had always claimed. Someone ordered this. Someone made sure the fire destroyed enough that no one could contest ownership of the land afterward. William felt his stomach drop, his hands gripping the phone tighter than necessary. He asked if his father's name was among those involved. The investigator hesitated for a moment before saying that there were no documents signed directly by Charles Carter, but that it was impossible for something of that magnitude to have happened without his knowledge. Furthermore, there was another name involved. A man who, years ago, was responsible for mediating the expropriation of land. A man who, ironically, now worked for one of William's closest allies within the company. Nausea rose to his throat. For years, he convinced himself that even though SG Group was corrupt, he could change things from within, that he could use his position to build something different. But there was no more room for illusions. His own name was linked to that dirty past, and if he wanted to break with that, he would need to destroy everything he built. But before anything else, I needed to find Kate. She was in court, eyes fixed on the laptop in front of her, case documents spread out across the table, when she heard her name called. William was standing at the door, his expression serious, a weight contained in his gaze. She felt the muscles in her body tighten immediately, the anger rising to the surface like an instinct. He asked what he wanted, his voice sharp as a blade. William took a few steps forward, ignoring the curious looks of the other lawyers around, and said he needed to talk to her. Kate let out a dry laugh, wondering if he was there to convince her to back off. He said if that was the case, he was wasting his time. William looked at her silently for a moment before saying that he wanted to show her something. He held out a thick envelope toward you, his fingers slightly tense as he held it. Kate hesitated before picking it up, but when she opened it and saw the documents inside, she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. There were records, transcripts of meetings, testimonies that linked the SG group directly to the destruction of the village where it grew up. And in the midst of it all, a name she never expected to see. Your own father. Kate felt her throat close, the words dying before they could escape. His father wasn't just a victim. He was one of the government officials who had approved the land deal. He signed documents that, without even knowing it, helped turn his home into a target. She looked up at William, shock mixed with anger, confusion, pain that seemed to pierce every part of her being. He asked how he got those documents. William responded that he spent years trying to understand how SG Group worked from the inside. That, as much as I was part of that system, I always knew that, one day, I would need to destroy it. And that, now, she had the power to do it. Kate felt her hands shaking, her breathing quickening, her heart racing in her chest. She spent her entire life feeding on the pain of that tragedy, using it as fuel to become the woman she was now. And yet, here was the truth, his family wasn't just victims. Your father was somehow involved in the system that destroyed them. William's voice came lower, more controlled, when he said he knew how much it hurt her. But she needed to decide what to do with this truth. That he could continue fighting, he could take down SG Group once and for all, but to do so he would need to expose everything. Even the part involving his father. Kate stood up, the chair creaking against the floor, the documents tight between her fingers. The truth weighed. Revenge was there, within his reach. But now, she knew that whatever path she chose would have a price. William watched her for a moment before saying that no matter what choice she made, he would be by her side. Kate didn't respond. He just walked out of the room with firm steps, the world spinning around him as he tried to find an answer to the only question that really mattered. What was worth more? Justice or what was left of your heart? The rain was punishing Seoul again that night, thick and relentless, as if trying to wash away the city's sins, but Kate knew that some scars could never be erased. The weight of the documents in his hand seemed much heavier than the sheets of paper they contained, as if his entire existence had been reduced to that decision. Justice or love? Truth or redemption? For years, he believed his mission was clear. Bring down SG Group, expose every crime, make sure no one else goes through what she went through. But now, the truth presented itself before her with nuances she had never considered. His father wasn't just a victim. He was somehow involved in the system that destroyed his family. William was not just a corrupt heir. He tried, in his own way, to change something that was perhaps impossible to change. And she, Kate Larson, spent so much time feeding the hate that she no longer knew what would be left if it were ripped out of her. The city lights flickered against the taxi's windows as she stared at her own reflection in the fogged glass. The court was waiting for him. The evidence he had was definitive. If he handed over everything to the prosecutor that night, the SG Group empire would collapse. Charles Carter would finally face justice. But so did William. He would not emerge unscathed. His name was too linked to the company, the contracts, the businesses that perpetuated that rotten system. He knew that. And yet, he placed everything in her hands. The taxi stopped in front of the court building, but Kate didn't move. He felt his cell phone vibrate in his coat pocket and, for a moment, he hesitated before looking at the screen. William didn't answer. He got out of the car without looking back, steps firmly against the wet sidewalk, the folder with the documents protected against his chest. He crossed the lobby as if it were a battlefield, ignoring the stares of the other lawyers, their conversations muffled by the sound of rain against the glass. Everything seemed distant, as if she were trapped in a fog where only one thing mattered, making her decision before it was too late. When he arrived at the prosecutor's office, the man looked up from the stack of papers in front of him, surprised by his presence. He asked if she had anything for him. Kate took a deep breath. He looked at the folder. He felt the weight of years of pain and struggle pressing down on his shoulders. And then, he placed the documents on the table. Said there was something he needed to see. The silence that followed was deafening. The process was officially opened the following day. The news spread through Seoul like wildfire, headlines appearing in the newspapers, journalists surrounding the SG Group offices, the names involved being dragged into the eye of the storm. Charles Carter's empire was finally beginning to crumble. But along with him, William. Kate avoided cameras, microphones, and persistent questions. She knew they were trying to turn it into a spectacle, but for her, it was just the end of a war. Or perhaps, the beginning of another. He didn't see him in the days that followed. I didn't know where he went after the investigations began to deepen. Until, one night, he appeared. She was leaving the office when she found him leaning against the black car, his face more tired than she had ever seen it before. He said he hoped she would be the one to find him first. She replied that she didn't know if she wanted to see him. William laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. He said he found it curious that, after everything, she still couldn't decide how she felt about him. Kate crossed her arms, feeling the cold of the night cross her skin. He said he didn't know if he still wanted to hate him or if he just wanted to forget he existed. William took a deep breath before saying that it didn't matter anymore. It would fall together with SG Group. Kate stared at him for a long moment, trying to understand what was behind his words. He asked if that was what he wanted. William didn't respond right away. He looked around at the city, the bright signs flashing as if mocking everything he was about to lose. He said he spent his entire life trying to convince himself that he could change things without completely breaking them. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe, in the end, some things needed to be destroyed before they could be rebuilt. Kate felt something inside her tighten. It wasn't exactly pain. It wasn't exactly relief. It was something indefinable, something that reminded her of all the times she met his gaze and felt like they were trapped in something they couldn't control. She asked where he was going. William gave a half smile, a tired smile, before saying he didn't know. But for once, maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Silence stretched between them, filled with everything they never said, everything they might never be able to say. Kate closed her eyes for a moment before asking if he wanted her to go with him. William didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, as if trying to understand how far she would go. So I finally said no. He said that if she went, maybe one day she would regret it. And Kate knew, in that instant, that he was right. She didn't say anything when he got into the car. I didn't say anything when the engine started, when the taillights gleamed against the wet asphalt. He just stood there, watching William Carter disappear into the night. The case against SG Group continued without him. Charles Carter was indicted. The company slowly collapsed, like a house of cards being blown away by the wind. Kate kept fighting, kept seeking justice, kept being the woman she spent her life trying to be. But sometimes, on quiet nights like this, he looked at his phone and wondered where it was. If I would ever come back. If I would ever see him again. Perhaps yes. Maybe never. But somehow I knew that no matter what happened, he would always be the invisible scar that you would carry forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.